Welcome to the Australian Hiker Podcast, Australia's longest running hiking podcast, downloaded over 1 million times worldwide and providing you with an Australian perspective on all things hiking. We're your hosts, Tim and Jill Savage, coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country.
In today's episode 298, we catch up with hikers Simon and Cheryl Stadden to talk about their recent adventure trekking to the K2 base camp. We hope you enjoy. Before we get into today's episode, if you'd like to help support Australian Hiker and this podcast, there are a couple of ways that you can help us out. Firstly, by subscribing on your podcast host of choice so that each episode is available as soon as it's published. And if you have the opportunity, leave us a 5-star review. Another way to support us is go to the Australian Hiker website at www.australianhiker.com.au and click on the Support Us page and buy us a coffee. You can do a one-off donation or become a monthly supporter. All donations are greatly appreciated and help us to continue producing this podcast and blog. Now let's get on to today's episode. For many hikers, a key bucket list hike has been trekking to the Everest Base Camp. However, this track along with the world's tallest mountain has become less unique and more pedestrian. Recently, I was contacted by hikers Simon and Cheryl Stadden, who tracked the K2 base camp, something that I wasn't even aware was a thing and something I was keen to find out more about. Simon, Cheryl, thanks for taking the time to chat with Australian Hiker about your unique track.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks very much for having us.
Okay, now, before we discuss your trip, please give us a brief introduction to yourself, your general background and your involvement in hiking.
I've been a business owner of a commercial property company for about 25 years. I retired about 2 to 3 years ago, and I've basically always been into nature, kayaking, mountain bike riding, sailing, hiking, that type of thing. Both Cheryl and myself have been involved in hiking for many years. It probably goes back to the 1990s. We did a trip that was about 12 months to India and China. It was really quite an epic trip. And part of that trip, we went to Nepal and we did the Annapurna Base Camp, which was a trek of about 12 days. So sort of hiking background has been around for a long time. I did Everest Base Camp with my youngest son in 2018, and also Cheryl and I did Larapinta in 2022, or part of it, which I think, Tim, you've done that yourself.
We have. We did that in 2016. That was our first hike for Australian Hiker.
Yeah, and the other trek we did recently was last year. We did part of the Southwest Coastal Path in the UK, in Cornwall.
So I think we've always incorporated trekking into the holidays that we've done, but most recently we've started to do a lot more of those sort of multi-day walks, and I think we're both pretty hooked on that type of trekking now. It's very addictive once you start, and it's a really nice way of just kind of getting to know a place a little bit better by spending a bit more time and challenging yourself, I guess. So the Annapurna one was a long time ago, and that's a great experience, an introduction to, a little bit of altitude. We didn't use porters at the time because there wasn't that many porters doing those sort of treks, so we just kind of did it ourselves, and yeah, it was an amazing experience, and I think we've both been a bit hooked on trekking since then.
Okay, now you've mentioned a few tracks through there, and I'll come back to those in a moment, but let's get on to your K2 base camp track. Really, for me, until you'd made contact with me, I hadn't really been aware that this was a thing. I'd always heard about the Everest base camp track and a few of the Annapurna track, but I hadn't heard about this one. Why did you decide to do this track, and who was the instigator of it?
Well, I was definitely the instigator in the whole thing. I think I was looking for a challenge. I wanted to sort of choose. I said to Cheryl, I want to set up myself for some kind of challenge. I wanted something fairly epic, iconic, and just really to get out of my comfort zone. I think I felt a little bit too comfortable. And I saw this trek. I'm on the World Expeditions mailing emails, and I just saw this trek, and I just couldn't get it out of my head. I kept on seeing it. They kept on promoting it. And I said to Cheryl one day, I want to do this trek. And I wasn't really expecting Cheryl to sort of say that she wanted to do the same thing. I wasn't exactly sure, but after I sort of started talking about it, she sort of came back to me and said that she would like to do it as well. But I really did not want to influence her in any way. It had to be her decision because I knew it was going to be incredibly tough.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, I must admit, when you sent the information on this trip a few weeks ago, I was thought, okay, this is going to be it's going to be an 8 or a 9 day sort of trip. But I noticed you sent me the material from World Expeditions, and it's actually a 27-day trip all up. Not all of that hiking, but even so, it's still a fairly long, in-depth sort of trip, and a lot of it's spent above altitude as well, at high altitude as well.
It is. Look, I think it's fair that both of us, we both signed up for it, but I don't think we sort of expected it to be as hard as it was. It was the toughest thing we've ever done. But that's not to say other people, younger people, might find it quite easy. But I have to say,
think so.
I think we both found it incredibly tough. But such a challenge and such an experience.
Yeah, I think I saw the thing that influenced me a little bit more, I guess, on doing the trek was I saw we go to some of those film festivals, the Radical Reels and Banff and those sort of adventure film festivals. And there was a short film on the Karakoram and the K2 area. And I had no idea. I was just watching it, looking at this incredible scenery. And at the end, I said to Simon, that's amazing, that trek in Pakistan. And he said, well, that's the trek. That's what I'm wanting to do. That's the one.
Yeah.
And that kind of made me start, sort of looking into it and, making that decision to maybe go along. And, so it took me probably a month or so to make the decision to go and do it because it's quite out of my comfort zone.
It was definitely out of both of our comfort zones, but I was very careful. As I said before, I didn't want to influence Cheryl in any way. But what I used to do is I used to pass on bits of marketing material every few days to try and encourage her along, because I was blown away by the fact that she was considering it. It just made so much sense to me. We've had so many adventures over the years. We're celebrating 30 years of marriage this year, and we've done so much together. The fact that she wanted to do this with me was just incredible. So, but as I say, I just sent marketing material and eventually wore her down, I think.
Yeah.
I've had a few podcast interviews about that where people have left stuff lying around the house and not being overt about it, but almost being very very covert. And anyway, at least to try and prompt people into thinking this is what we want to do.
Yes.
Yes.
Now, one of the things that you mentioned, you've gone through and done the Everest Base Camp, and I think one of the things that really caught my eye in relation to K2. I've seen some of the photos of Everest Base Camp. It almost looks like a major city these days. At its peak, there seem to be hundreds of tents and thousands of people there, and even climbing Everest these days, it looks like a traffic jam during the peak periods. Whereas this one, I think it doesn't seem to have the profile that the Everest Base Camp does. And certainly the Everest Base Camp is a shorter sort of trip. But this one really did catch my eye. And I must admit, that was probably before I realised it was a 27-day trip, 19 days of that tracking. But it looks like it's a bit more solitude, not hundreds of people there at any one time. and some of the images you went through and sent me, there didn't appear to be thousands of people there. So is that about the gist of it?
No, that is the case. Look, as you know, I've been to both Everest Base Camp and K2 Base Camp, but I would never put anybody off going to Everest Base Camp. It is just incredible. But you're dead right. The numbers there are so much greater, and that was the attraction of the K2 Base Camp as a logical sort of extension to my Everest Base Camp. Just to give you numbers, and don't quote me, it's very hard to get numbers, but apparently, I mean, if you Google the amount of trekkers who go to Everest Base Camp, it actually says at one point about 100,000 a year, but that's incorrect. I think it's more like 40 or 50,000 trekkers go to Everest Base Camp. With K2 Base Camp, it's something like 1,500 or 2,000. So that kind of puts it in perspective. I think that number is changing very quickly, and it's the same with climbers who are climbing K2. There's more and more, it's being discovered more. So I think that was another reason I wanted to do it, was to get in early before the numbers really, really increase. I think they will, logically.
It's a very short trekking period in K2 for the K2 base camp, because you have to climb. You obviously have to go in the summer, which makes it incredibly hot when you start the trek. But there's a huge amount of snow and avalanche potential up the top around the base camp and over the pass. So I think it's a shorter trekking period than you get in Everest, the Everest region as well, and that's why there's a bit more of a concentration of trekkers going. But we never felt, even in the camp, that it was overcrowded. I mean, we felt like there was a lot of people around, but they were mainly porters, because they have huge numbers of porters bringing all the gear up in Pakistan. So it felt like there was a lot of people on a quite a narrow track, but it never, there was big periods where you'd be trekking, you could be on your own and there'd be no one in sight, kind of thing, which is very, very lovely.
You mentioned, you did say that this is probably the hardest thing you've ever done, and again, even with 19 days on of tracking, that's still a very long, involved sort of trip. What sort of preparation did you do physically to prepare yourself for this trip? I mean, did you start working on this months in advance or a year in advance, or was it you're going in 2 months and you need to get fit in that time period?
We started around Christmas, but then we had another holiday in Patagonia,
That's right.
which was lovely, because we got to do some trekking over there as well. But we probably started 6 months, the beginning, because we started in the beginning of the year. And we looked at a few different programs actually to do, which was concentrating on sort of altitude preparation, but we ended up doing a program through our physiotherapist, and he just kind of put together a strength and aerobic sort of program on an app, and we followed that, which was good. And then we just tried to incorporate as much other exercise as we could. So we did weekend bushwalks, lots of sort of cross training. I mean, I do a lot of yoga. Simon does a fair bit of kayaking. So we just tried to incorporate as much as we could. We would both agree that we probably could have been a little bit fitter.
I never
aerobically.
I never felt ready for it, really. But,
Yeah.
I think you can overthink these things, but we definitely both did exercise. If we hadn't done the exercises that this physio got us to do, weights and all sorts of things, we would have really, really struggled. I mean, we struggled, but we just wouldn't have been able to do it.
Yeah. Sort of hill training. We probably could have kind of increased the hill training and that sort of thing, because it was just so relentless, the sort of terrain, that I think I could have done with a little extra level of fitness.
Well, we had
in
a couple
retrospect.
we had a couple of injuries as well in the training period. I had tendonitis of my right foot, which was slowing me down from exercising. That got very frustrating. And I think Cheryl
Yeah,
had a knee issue.
I had a bit of a dodgy knee, which I was worried about. But once we were on the trek, we actually didn't have any of those issues with feet or knees or anything. It was really just the sort of altitude, that climbing, that constant climbing and rough terrain. And actually the heat on the trek was probably the most difficult thing that we both struggled with in the beginning, because it was very, very hot.
Tim, you would not believe the temperature variation. I mean, we flew into Islamabad and that was 40 degrees, but even at the start of the trek, it was so hot. It was so hot. And also at the top, at base camp, it was so cold. So
Extremes.
Real extremes. And it was like hot and cold on the same day. It was extraordinary.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did the Salcantay trek in South America probably about 12 years. Oh, in fact, it was more than that. It was 18 years ago. And we had just at the highest point on the trip, we had snow and it was fairly cold. And, by about 2 or 3 hours later, we were down in the tropics. And it definitely felt tropical. So it's not surprising with those sort of areas that are very high that you do have those extremes. Was there special gear that you needed, or was it pretty much standard hiking gear?
Yes, boots were essential to do this trek. I don't think you could really do them in trail runners. I know that's the trend for hiking today. But the K2 base camp is just notorious. It's known for sort of shredding any type of footwear because it is so relentless. It is so rocky. It is just physically demanding, and there is no real path for most of the way. So it really does challenge any kind of footwear. So Cheryl had Scarpa boots. I had some Merrell boots. It was a bit of a funny story. I had to take my boots back. I think it was either three or four times. But I have bunions and I struggle with footwear sometimes. But eventually I got the right pair.
I must admit, I'm the same. I've got fairly wide feet, and trying to find footwear that length I can manage, typically on the boots, but the width is limited. And it's I must admit, there's one particular pair. If I am wearing boots, which are Scarpas again, which are probably the main ones that do fit me.
There was quite a list of gear. We were quite shocked at the extensive list of gear that we had to bring.
It was staggering, the list of gear.
But it was very good because they did actually recommend certain brands for different things. And, we had to buy a few things that we probably won't use that much, just very incredibly warm sort of things and we only used them a few times at the very top. The other thing that we did need to get was a sleeping bag that rated under. We're down to minus
15. And we've got sleeping bags that go to sort of 0 or something, but we didn't. We just ended up hiring them. But most of the group actually had their own stuff because
they'd done a few other treks like that, I think.
Well, they've also done. They were planning. Part of the group were planning to do a Pastore Peak, which goes to 6,200 meters. So, because it was an entry-level mountaineering trek, but we were never going to do that. We were just going to go to base camp and over this snow pass. But they had mountain climbing boots that cost, 1,000 Aussie dollars, that type of thing. And they didn't end up doing that peak because there was too much snow and too much danger of avalanche.
There was a lot of gear that, we had to sort of tick off and make sure that we had.
We had to have it. We just, it was essential.
We pretty much used everything.
We did.
Everything that we brought, we used on the trek. So, So we're just going to have to make sure we use it again somewhere.
No, we will. So we will for sure.
So that included the snow gear as well, did it?
Yes. Well, yes, it did. On the snow pass, we had harnesses and we were roped in. We didn't actually have crampons.
Well, they provide World Expeditions provided the harness and the crampons. So,
Yeah.
and the tents were obviously provided. We had to bring our own like sleeping mat. Yeah, all that sort of thing.
That was the other thing, was camping. I mean, I haven't camped for 20 days or whatever it was for a long time. That was probably a challenge in itself. But they were nice tents, and it was fine.
So I was going to say, did you carry a day pack and the porters carried the big heavy stuff, or were you carrying everything?
Yeah, no, that's right. We had a day pack, and we had up to sort of, I think with water, we did have to have a lot of water. So
I was drinking about 4 litres a day in the early sections of the trek where it was so dusty and so hot. It actually really affected me, the lower sections. I think I'm from England originally, so it's like Mad Dogs and Englishmen. It really, really did affect me, and we ran out of water on one day.
and that weighs a lot. So there was water. We probably had up to, I don't know, 7 kilos, 6 to 7 kilos.
That's right, because the weather can change at any point, so you have to carry, a puffer jacket, rain jacket, rain gear, and everything. So it does weigh a bit, and the water weighs a lot.
So we'd have sort of a duffel bag that we'd have to pack everything from our sort of tent in the morning. So our sleeping gear, sleeping bag, the clothes. So that would need to be packed up every morning and left outside the tent. And then the porters would sort of pack that all up and do the hard job of walking with the with the duffel bags.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I suppose all we had to do was walk. Everything else was pretty much catered for. And we were thinking, how hard can this be? All we have to do is walk.
But it was hard. It was hard.
Yeah. Makes you wonder how people ever actually climbed these mountains or went to these places 50 or 60 years ago. The gear was particularly heavy in those days compared to what it is now. And we've got a bit of a luxury these days with all these ultralight gear. But as you say, even without the gear, it still impacts.
I agree. What those early explorers did was extraordinary. Absolutely.
Okay, now let's talk about the trip logistics. So talk us through from the start to finish. So you left Australia. Where did you fly to, and what was the next steps from then on?
So we flew into Islamabad, Sydney to Islamabad, where I said it was about
Bangkok.
Via Bangkok, where it was about 40 degrees. We had a few days when we met the group at the hotel. There was 13 of us in this particular group, with a expedition or mountain guide who actually had climbed Mount Everest. Of those 13 people, 9 I think were Australian.
Yep.
Then there was an American, Swedish, Japanese, and
English. Yep.
So it was a bit of a mixture, but sort of weighting toward Aussies, I suppose, because it's World Expeditions is an Australian company.
So it was a good group, good mix of people. We were the only couple on the trip, which was interesting. We were sort of expecting maybe another couple, or so the rest was single travellers.
Yeah, they were all single travellers. I asked the guide, Soren, whether that he sees many couples, and he said no, he doesn't. They tend to be more single travellers, which was interesting.
Yeah.
Funnily enough, I've done a couple of World Expedition trips, and in all honesty, I think I found the same thing, that we were a couple and just about everybody else on the trips were singles, or they might have been, father and daughter or father and son sort of thing, but very few couples, which is surprising.
Yeah.
Yes, so from Islamabad, when the group all got together, we flew from Islamabad to Skardu, which I think was about an hour's flight over the Himalayas or the Karakoram. And we saw Nanga Parbat, huge mountain on the way there. You fly into Skardu and you're completely surrounded by mountains straight away. And it was still quite hot, wasn't it?
It's sort of they call it the gateway to the Karakoram. And it's a really interesting place, Skardu. And if we hadn't made that flight, hadn't been able to do that flight, which apparently is quite common, that they cancel the flight because it's up in the mountains and it's very weather dependent, then we would have had to do a 2-day jeep ride on the Karakoram Highway, which apparently is quite horrendous.
You really want to avoid it.
So we were very, very pleased that we managed to do it there and back. We managed to do the flight, and it saved a lot of discomfort and possible injury.
Well, actually, we did the Jeep ride, but not from Skardu.
We did a shorter.
We did a shorter
ride,
one.
yeah.
So thank goodness we could do the main plane trip. But we did a Jeep ride from Skardu to Escole, which is where you start walking. So that Jeep ride, I think it was about 7 hours.
Yeah.
And that in itself was just remarkable. It was following the edge of the Indus River some of the time, and it just drops off. It's a sheer drop into glacial waters, a raging river, and it's really quite a scary Jeep ride.
Bone-jarring.
You can be quite tired by the time you get there just from the hanging on to the seats as you're going. Yeah, so I suppose really with this sort of trip, most people tend to make the assumption that you land, you might have a short drive, and then you start walking almost straight away. But in this case, it's very much a planes, trains, and automobiles to get there.
Yes.
You're landing, you've got to get yourself, as you say, a couple of days with the group and then actually travelling to the site. So I can understand the length of the trip involved because this is in a remote area, isn't it? It's not as if it's outside the city.
It's very remote, Tim. It's such a remote part of the world. Apparently, the Karakoram is one of the most glaciated regions outside of the two poles. So it really is remote.
And I think they always build in contingency days at either end of the trip, just because it is one of those countries that there can be issues with transport. So, there was the first day that we arrived in Escole to start walking. That was meant to be another Jeep day, and they'd fixed up a bridge so we didn't have to drive. We could walk. We could start trekking a day earlier. And that was, a month earlier, people had to drive for another 7 hours or something. So things like that, it's very changeable, Pakistan. And also on the way back, on our trip on the way back, that was a bit up in the air as to whether we would have to retrace our steps and walk back the same way that we came from the K2 base camp, or whether we could go over this kind of tricky pass. And we fortunately were able to do the pass, so we didn't have to retrace our steps. But that's never decided. It's you never know until you're up there, and the weather can change in a day. So.
Well, in actual fact, it did change. We were one of the last groups to get over the pass because a couple of groups behind us didn't make it, which meant they had to walk back the same way through this hot and dusty valley. And we were all so pleased that we got over that pass.
It's always nice to be able to do a loop.
Unless you've got something really spectacular you want to see again. But as you say, it's it sounds like the first part of this trip was more about getting to the good stuff.
Yes.
And you got to as you said, you got to do a loop rather than having to do it out and back, which is definitely a good way to go.
Yeah, it really was.
So, from your perspective, you sound like you've done a lot of travelling quite widely. What's travel like in Pakistan as a general thing? Is it a hard sort of place to travel in as far as the logistics and tourist friendly, or is it a have they getting their act together and it's a good place to be?
Well, it's an amazing country, such welcoming people. Scenery is just overwhelming, particularly the part we saw. But I think it's very hard. We don't know many people who have been to Pakistan. It really is an incredible country. But I think this is where a company like World Expeditions comes in, that they can do all the logistics for you, and they can take you out of a country like Australia and put you in the middle of Pakistan. I think that's just incredible for 30 days where you don't really have to think about logistics. Everything's organized for you, and that's really what you're paying for.
Yeah, I don't think you get it. I don't think they've quite got their head around tourism in Pakistan.
No, they haven't.
It's not probably not the safest place to travel. If you read the Smart Traveller guide, it still says caution.
Reconsider
your need to travel.
That's in certain parts. Some parts, well, that kind of puts a lot of people off, and it put us off, to be honest.
Yeah, but there's a lot of political unrest, obviously, in Pakistan, and there has been for a long time, and I think it will continue. So I think it's a place like many, developing countries that you've got a lot of challenges with everything, with your everyday sort of moving around the country. But I quite enjoy that sort of travel, that challenge of travel. And as Simon was saying, I think if you're going through a company that's making all that logistical stuff easy, which World Expeditions did, we found them really good. And local guides, like they hired heaps of local guides and porters, and they were all incredible. I found them just such a lovely, respectful, group of people with nothing but praise for the people we met. The porters were fantastic, and
we had 60 porters for 13 of us. So you really are, doing something for the local economy, which is a great thing, really.
I mean, it sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? 60 porters.
It does sound crazy, but we had low altitude porters and we had high altitude porters. We have mules, and it employs a lot of people. So, and it's a very short season. It's like 2 or 3 months, whereas Nepal you have like 2 seasons. Yes, they haven't really got their act together, not like Nepal, but Pakistan has so much to offer.
I think at the moment, tourism for Pakistan is trekking. There are more people wanting to trek in Pakistan because it is so incredible. Yeah, but I really hope that people do visit there. I think, I'd encourage people to visit there because
if you want something different, you got to be flexible. It's not for everyone, put it that way.
I think with countries where they do say, give you travel advice and travel warnings, that's where it really does pay to go through a company like World Expeditions, where they do all the hard work for you rather than just turning up as an individual or a couple and trying to do it yourself.
Yes.
I think yes, it costs you more, but I think they know what they're doing, and I think it takes all the worry out of a lot of the travel, that you really don't want to have to deal with by yourself.
Absolutely, and that includes the safety aspect as well, because that was very much at the back of our minds. And they were, the local guides and World Expeditions, they've been doing this for years. They're one of the few companies that does, and it's a very important consideration.
Expedition leader had previously been to Pakistan a number of times, so we felt quite confident with him as well, that he was very familiar with the people and the landscape. So that was very helpful.
Now, once you were actually on trail, and I know it's going to vary depending on where you are and what you're doing, but take us through a typical day on trail.
It always started off with bed tea, which is always very nice for someone to knock on one of the porters, to knock on the door of the tent and wake you up. Normally very early, usually around 5, with your cup of tea. So that was lovely. And then it was the scramble to get all the whatever you pulled out of your duffel bag back into the bag, which was just a daily nightmare for me. So, sort of putting the sleeping bag, folding up your bedding, all your clothes, everything has to go back into this not very big duffel bag and left outside the tent for the porters. Just
on that, we hired the sleeping bags, as we said earlier, but they're actually a lot bigger than what
enormous.
We thought. They took up a quarter to a half of the duffel bag. Yeah. So it was a struggle every time trying to get our stuff stuffed into those.
We had to sit on top of the bags to zip them up. It was just hilarious. It was a daily challenge we were exhausted before we started trekking.
I think that's the thing, isn't it? It's, as you say, you hire the sleeping bag rather than spending potentially $1,200 to $1,500 on an alpine sleeping bag. But the downside is you got something that's a bit bigger and a bit bulkier than the
Yes.
high quality expensive bags tend to be.
Right.
That's
Yep.
right.
Yeah.
That's right. Then we'd have breakfast, and the food, I must say, the food was fantastic. They were so amazing what they managed to produce, those cooks on the trip. So we usually had a really hearty breakfast, lots of carbs, porridge or pancakes or chapatis, all sorts of things, something different all the time. But we were normally on the trail, I'd say about 7:30, sort of. That'd be the latest we'd be walking, which was great when we were lower because of the heat. A bit harder when it was colder to get moving in the morning, but when it was hot, it was good to start early. And we'd probably walk for about 4 hours. And then, there'd be a few little stops on the way, but there was a lot of a lot of distance to cover. Sometimes we'd stop for lunch, and the cooks had set up a table, and we'd have soup and pasta and that sort of thing. Other days we'd keep going and get to the camp. So it just depended on how long the days were. Some were 6 to 7 hours. A couple of times the short days were sort of 4 to 5, and then we had a few really long days. So it did vary, but probably 6 to 7 hours was our sort of standard day of walking.
And some rest days.
And a couple of rest days.
Yeah, just to acclimatise. Actually, in the early stages, we were also tested on a hike that went from 2,300 to about 4,300 straight up, and I think it was a test done by the leader of the trek just to see where we were on fitness, and that was quite something, because I thought at that point I'm definitely in the wrong group because everybody seemed so fit.
I think it was a bit of a race. There was a bit of a who can show their fitness. I don't know. We felt like maybe we had joined the wrong group at that stage, but it all sort of worked out in the end.
That was one of the
leveled out.
That was one of the challenges, both physical and mental. Really that affected me mentally. I think that I had to work out in my own head, and it took me 2 or 3 days to get that right.
I remember when we did Bhutan, we sort of typically started the morning with an ascent of sort of 500 to 1,000 meters. Just rambled through the day, and then quite often we had another 1,000 meters just before we finished the end of the day. So
yes.
You certainly know when you're going uphill, and particularly in the higher altitudes.
Was that the Snowman trek, Tim?
No, we did the Gaia to Lhasa track. So it was we looked at doing the Snowman track, and thankfully we didn't, because the weather was horrendous. Because they ran that trek just before what we did, and the entire trip was raining and very muddy as well. So we were lucky. We did we picked one of the easier trips, and I think we had sun, virtually no rain, and it was a really, really lovely experience. But, and I think that's it as well. You tend to think about trips in the alpine regions and the Himalayas being snow, but you do get rain occasionally, and it's a bit of a shock to the system when it does.
Yes.
That's on our list, Bhutan.
Yes, that is on our list.
Definitely on our list.
Yeah.
You get to camp at the end of the day, and what happens from there?
Oh, well, really from there it's just a matter of sort of settling into camp. Just either sort of having a look around, taking lots of photos, of course, resting, usually just sitting in one spot for an hour, drinking tea, and just trying to recover from the day's trek. Writing in journals, bit of reading. I mean, it's just that was probably my favourite part of the day, really, was just having that lovely downtime of just soaking in the beautiful scenery. If we were a bit lower down, there was a couple of times we could have like a tent shower, but mostly there was no showers, so that wasn't something that you could do, unfortunately.
But a hot bucket of water.
But even a hot bucket of water was nice.
Is fine. I mean, to be honest, that's all you need. It's amazing, how much better you feel after a hot bucket of water.
But yeah, just dinner. We'd eat dinner quite early. Or we'd often be in bed by 8 o'clock. Because it was, up higher, it was quite cold. So, you didn't sort of want to sit around in the mess tent for too long and get cold. So, and everybody was exhausted.
Yes.
We were up so early. So, normally in bed and asleep by 8 o'clock, which is...
so they had a kitchen
routine.
tent and a mess tent. And the mess tent up sort of in Concordia... The K2 base camp got very cold actually at night.
Yes, well, it was snowing a lot when we were up at the top.
So you wanted to get into your sleeping bag a lot of the time.
What was the landscape like? I mean, obviously K2 is one of the tallest mountains in the world, but what's the actual scenery like overall? Is it pretty much mountain terrain and you're walking between the valleys and working your way up, or what's it like?
Yeah, so you started in the early sections, as we said, sort of hot and dusty, and it's just climbing all the time until you sort of get into the snow areas. But to be honest, the scenery in Pakistan is just, it starts from Skardu. It's just overwhelming, even in the early stages, because there's all these granite towers everywhere. There's a place called Trango Towers where some Australians jumped off in 1985.
Did a base jump.
With wingsuits and that type of thing. But it is rocky the whole way. The amount of stones that we stepped over, I have no idea, but it was in the millions. It was just crazy. There was no real path. That's the other thing. With Everest Base Camp, there's a pretty well-trodden path. With K2 Base Camp Trek, it's constantly changing because you're also walking on a glacier for a lot of the way, which is the Baltoro Glacier. The way you go, the way the porters go and the guides go, it changes every year pretty much.
Yes, because it's moving and...
Because it's on moraine. Yeah. You're walking on moraine. So it's so... relentless, and you can't look down. You can't look at so much at the scenery. You have to stop. If you look at the scenery as you're walking, you're going to trip over on something and sprain an ankle. And it's amazing no one did that.
What about animal and bird life? Was there anything at that sort of altitude, or it was more down lower on?
Yeah, it was more. We did see some marmots in the Deso Plains, which is just outside of Skardu. That's like a national park, and they're like huge wombats, I suppose, the size of wombats.
Never seen them before.
Very weird creatures. So we saw a few of those. But to be honest, we really did not see much wildlife at all. We were a bit surprised that we didn't see more. I mean, they apparently have snow leopards somewhere in Pakistan.
Well, you wouldn't see them, but they're there apparently.
There's black bears in that the same region where we saw the marmots, but we didn't see any of those. I mean, birds, there was some beautiful, some red-billed sort of chow birds, they were called, in the lower camps, and some beautiful black kites. Lots of horses down lower, sheep on the valley on the other side of the pass. But, yeah, that was pretty much it, really, because once you get up a bit higher, there's not much up there. I mean, we had goats with us, but they were one-way goats. So
you couldn't get friendly with the goats.
You didn't want to look the goats in the eye and get to know them.
Because they were slaughtered halfway along and fed to us.
I hadn't thought about that. That's one way of doing it, isn't it? If you can't pack meat with you, you may as well make it walk along with you. So
I know. Yes, I found that a bit challenging.
Cheryl struggled with that.
I like those goats. They were very sweet.
What was for you, and it may be different for the two of you, what were some of the key highlights of the trip for you?
I think probably the welcoming Pakistani people was, and I had read about it before, but that was a real highlight. Everyone we met, all the porters and the guides were fantastic. Obviously, the scenery, it's so difficult to describe the scenery, but Concordia is the place, probably my favorite part of the whole trek. So it's the campsite in front of K2 pretty much. And apparently it's the only place on the planet where you can view 8,000 meter plus mountains in the world. Like it's just, I sort of describe it as otherworldly. It's like nothing I've seen, not even in Everest Base Camp, I think. So that was a real highlight.
Yeah, I think, the Pakistani people I loved as well. And I just found them, to be very, very warm. And I love their sort of attitude of, inshallah, like, will we get there today? Inshallah, God willing, there's sort of their attitude to everything was very relaxed. And
everything was God willing.
Everything was God willing, which I quite liked. And we adopted that mantra ourselves by the end of the trip or halfway through. And I think the camaraderie in our group was really nice as well. We sort of, I'm sure you've experienced it as well, Tim, when you start to get to know a group. I mean, it always takes a while and everybody's being very polite and then you sort of get to know people and their personalities. And we had a couple of very funny individuals. We had a geologist on the group who was quite funny and gave us a bit of an insight into the unstable rocks to the left and right of us. Just keep walking was his.
We used to ask him,
don't stop.
how does it look, Chris? And he said, "Oh, it's fine. It's fine. It'll be fine." But to be honest, the landscape and the scenery there is so sort of sketchy and potential for rockfall and avalanche. You really just have to go with it, but like mountaineers do, exactly the same kind of thing, and that's what we did, I think.
It's not good to hang around in one spot for too long.
No, take in the scenery, take photos, and keep on moving.
Yeah.
I think another highlight, well, for me, and I'm sure Cheryl feels the same, but the fact that we completed this as a couple, I think, is a real was amazing.
Yeah,
that we both wanted to do such a trip was incredible.
I think that's the thing. I mean, if you had have just done it by yourself, Simon, then coming home and having to try and explain it, and you've got no one to bounce ideas off, and 5-10 years from now, you can still talk about it, and you've got a shared memory.
That's
whereas,
right.
Doing it by yourself, you just tend to lose that, and you think, oh, did I really see that, or did I really come across that? So
yes.
Yeah, it's very true. You can talk to some people about your travels, usually people who have done a little bit of that sort of travel, but they, kind of glaze over after 5 or 10 minutes of descriptions, whereas Simon and I can bore each other, with our memories. And, it's really good to be able to just sort of sit back and just talk about some of the amazing experiences that we've had. And
it was a real sense of
special.
It was a real sense of achievement, not for just the two of us, but for the whole group. We all got over the snow pass. It was a huge responsibility on the guide to get us all over, because on the day of the snow pass, which we had to get up at 1 a.m. and climb with head torches, it took us 5 hours to get to the top, like 6 hours on the way down. It was so steep. But that is, like, I was often at the back. We were both often at the back, but I couldn't get up there 2 hours later than the others because it would have kept them waiting, and it was snowing, it was cold. And that really added to, pressure in your own head that you had to do it. So that was a really quite a challenge.
And it was an amazing feeling of achievement at the end of that day.
13 hours walking.
I think I was on a bit of a adrenaline high for a couple of days after that. I just felt so amazing. And I think also because we dropped in altitude, so I felt a bit better as well. It always makes a difference.
Okay, now you mentioned challenges, so let's talk about some of the challenges of this trip. Now, when in talking to you and setting up this interview, you said you spent about a fair amount of time at reasonably high altitude. Did you have any problems with altitude sickness, or did anyone in your group have problems with altitude sickness?
We both had mild altitude sickness. The first few days we both had quite severe headache.
Which I think is quite normal.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing more than that, but we were starting to feel the altitude, so we started taking Diamox, the altitude sickness medication, which I think it definitely helped.
Yeah.
There was one person on our trip that did suffer from, sort of moderate to, I don't know, severe, but he had to use some oxygen to help him up the pass, to get to the pass. And we also, World Expeditions have one of those altitude chambers.
It's like an oxygen chamber.
Yeah, so he used that. But he made it and he was fine. But he did struggle with altitude sickness, and he's done a lot of trekking in the past. So he was kind of disappointed in himself that this had happened. And, we was kind of saying, well, that's the thing with altitude sickness. It can happen to anyone. It doesn't discriminate. Fitness has got nothing to do with it, really. Unfortunately, it's just, the luck of the draw with altitude sickness. So, but just getting up the pass with that reduced oxygen was incredible. I mean, I'd take 2 steps and I'd be, gasping for breath. So it was very, and that's the highest. I've never been to that height before.
Yeah.
That was very high for me, 5,600 meters.
I think that's I've been to that roughly sort of 5,000 3 times before, and I've sort of said at the end of it, I probably don't need to go to that height again. Whilst it's not high for mountaineers, it's a pretty, it's still pretty high, and I just feel as though I don't need to go to that height, because every time I've done it, I've had some kind of symptom, and it's very unusual.
I must admit, the couple of trips where I have done a high altitude, where it's impacted on me is been down low. It's at the start of the trip, and then certainly as the trips progressed, 5,000 meters. Apart from sucking the fitness out of you,
yes.
That was probably the main issue. It was more 3,000, 3,500 meters where I had problems.
Okay.
Okay. But yeah, as I said, it isn't based on fitness. It's luck of the draw, and it's unfortunate. If you could say, the fitter you are, the less chance you are to get it. Everyone would be fit and they wouldn't have an issue, but it's not the way it works. So
no, that's right.
They say at 5,000, I think the oxygen levels are sort of 50% of what they are at sea level. So
yeah,
it really does suck the life out of you, literally. Other challenge is remoteness of the area. Toilets is always an issue on some of these treks.
Particularly for women,
yes.
When there's no trees.
You're above the tree line.
Above the tree line, and there's a lot of men everywhere. A lot of porters.
Yeah.
It was really tricky. But, that's just an interesting challenge to throw in there.
There was no internet. There was no internet for pretty much 20 days. That was almost refreshing in some ways. And also no alcohol.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. Being a Muslim country, it's sort of... but I must admit, I think I tend to avoid alcohol with altitude anyway. I think it just tends to knock you around too much.
Yeah,
but
it dehydrates you, I think. I think
Yeah.
it would have been quite nice to have maybe a celebratory drink at the end of our trip. But
cold beer.
But yeah, other than that, it wasn't too bad.
No. All right. Now, what advice would you give others who are looking to do this trip?
I think just being flexible and open-minded to change. We had a bit of a joke about the World Expedition notes that things were not quite what they said they'd be, but that's because you can't follow everything down to the last letter. Things change due to weather.
It's an expedition.
So it's an expedition.
You
need to be flexible.
Yeah, you can't go there expecting things are going to happen on this day. You might get snowed in. You really do need to be flexible, and I suppose some people aren't. So if you're not flexible, don't do this trip.
Yeah,
would be my advice.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's the same for any sort of adventure trip like this. As you say, if you're going from point A to point B and you're guaranteed of getting there, I suppose there's less adventure as such. It means that the trip you did isn't necessarily the trip that people after you do, and everyone has a unique experience from it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I think we've said this before. Embrace the mantra of inshallah, which is God willing.
What will be, will be.
What will be, will be. That's the advice. And you said, Cheryl, about the perceived fitness level, I think.
Yeah, I would probably suggest that whatever fitness level you're at, just increase it that little bit more. It's just going to be, as our leader, our expedition leader kept saying, it's money in the bank, being fitter. Well, he was talking about altitude, getting that little bit of extra altitude and then coming back down. But I think just being absolutely as fit as you can, probably walking on different terrain, just not, doing your average kind of bushwalk, making sure that you're including lots of steps and lots of uneven ground, just to give you that little bit of an extra edge, so it's not so much of a shock when you get there.
We've got what we call a goat track, not too far from where we live, that goes down to the river, and that was really good sort of training for this trek. We used to go up and down it 8 times or something. It was it's well worth having something like walking on a pavement isn't going to cut it for a trek like this.
No, you need as you say, you really don't want a formed concrete path or a dirt path. You want something that's a bit more irregular, just to get you up to speed. We've actually got a local mountain, and it's not a particularly big mountain, but it's a steepish sort of climb, and it's not a particularly smooth path. So I know a lot of the people that are actually climbing Everest, if they're living in Canberra, they use this one, and they'll do it 3 times in a day, just to simulate going from base camp up to the summit. But yeah, as you say, you've got to be prepared for not having the smooth paths and not having the easy walks that a lot of people think that it might be.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Just to give you an idea of difficulty, I suppose, we lost a fair bit of weight. It's a good way to lose weight. I lost about 7 kilos in a month, and Cheryl lost about 5. So
yeah, and we were eating,
eat well,
very well. I mean, we didn't really get sick. So yeah, it was amazing, and it was purely just the amount of walking, energy. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's good. Okay, so what's your next great adventure? And it sounds like you've certainly done plenty, but where to next?
Well, we're going to UK and Scandinavia next year. We might do some of the southwest coastal path. We did some 2 years ago, and we might do some of that. We might. I'm thinking of possibly a kayaking challenge, but still deciding, Tim.
And definitely
That's
Bhutan
right.
in the future. We definitely will go to Bhutan, but I don't think it'll be the snowman trek.
No, the snowman trek sounds brutal. A lot of the people on this particular trek had done the snowman trek. Actually, the guide rates some of the best hikes he reckons that of anywhere is Everest Base Camp, High Trails, I think it's called, K2 Base Camp, and also the Snowman Trek. Those were the three that he rates as the top ones.
Yeah, and I think the thing with Bhutan is I think they saw what was happening in Nepal with the fact you've got Starbucks in Kathmandu. Bhutan has kept it a bit more traditional and not so many people, but as a result, it's a good experience, and I'd certainly happily go back there again. It's a really enjoyable place, and I think you'd enjoy it as well. So
yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so we've been talking to Simon and Cheryl Stadden about their recent adventure tracking to the K2 base camp. Simon, Cheryl, thanks for taking the time to chat with us.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yes, thank you, Tim. That was fun.
Okay, so that was our interview with Simon and Cheryl Stadden on their K2 base camp track. As mentioned in the introduction, I just wasn't aware that this was an option. I think just about everyone's heard of the Everest base camp track. It is a very popular and often one that people tend to aim for at some stage through their hiking career. But I think for me, this sounded just. It's different. It's new, and certainly Cheryl and Simon were saying roughly around about 40,000 people go to Everest Base Camp. Now that includes mountaineers as well, but there's a lot of people that go up there. Whereas at the moment, by the sound of it, the K2 Base Camp track is roughly 1,500 odd people a year. So it's still new. It's still not well known, and I think it's still. A bit of solitude, I suppose. You're not going to get the big crowds that you get with Everest. One thing we didn't really discuss with this walk is the costings associated with it. Now, if you go online at the time of recording, the trip itself was roughly around about $10,000 per person. But on top of that, you had to add a couple of things. And one of those was airfares. And that's going to vary depending on where you come from in the world. So they can't include airfares as part of a fixed price because you could be coming from anywhere. So from Australia, the airfares returned varied to roughly around about $2,000 to $3,000 per person. So that's going to take it to about approximately $13,000.
I think that depends on how reliable you want your airline to be, but that's a personal choice.
And there were quite a lot of airways. There are Emirates and all sorts of other airlines taking part in this. So there was quite a lot to choose from through there, depending on the quality of what you want, the timing and availability, and also the pricing as well. The other cost, which they mentioned, is they didn't have a minus 15 degree sleeping bag, so they hired one. And if you are never going to go through and do alpine camping ever again, it's probably not a bad way to go. If you do a lot of cold weather camping, and very cold weather camping, it's worthwhile having your own bag.
But as they were saying, the downside of hiring one was that, you might have been warm, but the bulkiness of the sleeping bag took up a lot of space in their, very limited duffel bag that they were given.
And that was something that they were talking about. One of the hardest things they mentioned in the whole trip was packing their duffel bag every day. Yep. And we've done some world exhibition trips in previously, and we've had the same experience. Depending on what you've actually got, if you've got ultra light gear, very compact gear, the packing's a bit easier. If you've got very bulky sort of equipment, I think when we did our world expedition trips, we did exactly the same thing as Simon and Cheryl did. Sit on the bag, and the other person would zip it up.
Except the difference is, I think, when we did some of our trips, the porters weren't actually carrying our bags. So, the kind of consideration about having as light a gear as you possibly can, I think, comes into play when you realise that, someone is literally carrying your bag.
And I found it really interesting. They were saying that on their trip of 13 people, there were 60 porters in total. Now, some of those were used down at low altitude, some at a high altitude. And obviously the ones that are doing the high altitude stuff are doing it on a regular basis and are more used to the conditions and not going to have the issues that many people can have at altitude. But yeah, it's a really high percentage of staff to customers. And as they said, all they were really carrying was their day pack. Their sleeping gear, their extra clothing and all that sort of stuff was being carried on mules and with porters. So, and the porters were obviously carrying things like, they had to carry the mess tent and they do actually carry seating as well and all sorts of other stuff that you use in camp at the end of the day. They carry things like, typically World Expeditions tends to make lunch for you, so there'll be a designated lunch spot where you happen to come across them and they've set up a table and they're either doing a cold lunch or a cooked lunch. But certainly you aren't doing a budget trip with them. You're getting a lot for your money, and this is an expensive trip, so a lot of people may not be able to afford it. But what you get is very good value for money.
Well, I guess there's a couple of things. Firstly, it's a long trip. So, for those dollars, just think about, what the cost per day is. Think about what you're getting for the trip. Think about the fact that, you've got all your food and your meals being prepared for you. And also you've got the professionalism and the comfort as well of people who know what they're doing, which, goes a long way.
The other cost, which a lot of people tend not to be aware of, is the staff tips at the end of the trip. There's no fixed rate, if you like. They typically tend to leave it up to you to what you do. I must admit, it's always one of the hard things just to try and work out how much you should actually tip. Americans tend to be used to tipping 10%. Australians probably less so. So it's one of those things that I know when we've done our trips previously, we sort of got together as a group and tried to work out what was an appropriate tipping fee. We'd talk to the trip leader and try and work out what it was that we were supposed to be doing. But think about, these are people who, even though the porters are probably very well paid as far as Pakistan standards are concerned, they still are low paid. And the ability to tip them just helps them have a better lifestyle. The other comment I'd make as well is I think most people, they think of Pakistan and they think of all the issues and the military issues that they tend to have there. And as Cheryl and Simon's mentioned, that was a concern for them. But really that they're very well geared for this sort of stuff. The trip leader knows the area really well, knows the politics. And again, this is the sort of trip you don't just want to randomly turn up and do your own thing.
Wander about by yourself, no way. Yeah.
So, going on an organised trip by a commercial company, particularly in this instance, is certainly the way to go.
Yeah, and even Cheryl was mentioning the Smart Traveller advice from the Australian government that said reconsider. So that says everything, really. If you're really wanting to do something like this, you've got to do it with an organised group.
Now, the first high altitude trip that we ever did was South America, and we both had problems with that one with altitude. For me, it was actually in Cusco, which was the lowest point after going inland from the coastal area. And now I just had these almost hallucinating dreams, and I was fine the next day. Jill wasn't impacted at all at that stage, but when she started going up in altitude, she did have issues.
Yeah, that's right.
And we were both taking Diamox, which is the recommended medicine, if you like, for dealing with altitude sickness. I think from our perspective, we always tend to go to a travel doctor and get a script for it before we go. It's just better off to take it just to be on the safe side. And it is one of those sort of things that, there are things you can do, like not drinking, which in a Muslim country is probably not
not drinking alcohol.
Not drinking alcohol, that's right.
You need to stay hydrated, though.
Yeah, which in a Muslim country is not really an issue. Staying hydrated, as Jill said, being as fit as you possibly can, although that's never a guarantee. taking it easy as far as you can and taking rest days where you can.
And the interesting thing is that it's a combination of all of those things, and everybody is different. So, everybody could be equally hydrated, but somebody gets impacted, for example. Or if it's an individual we're thinking about, one circumstance may be not so good for you, another quite similar circumstance where you've taken all of the right sort of precautions may actually be, okay. So, it just depends. There are things that you can do, but then it's anybody's guess, I think.
And as they said, the trip itself came with a portable altitude chamber for treating altitude sickness, along with oxygen, and that was one of the reasons for so many porters.
Somebody's got to carry that one.
Yeah, and it's the sort of thing that when you're doing those sort of altitudes with a lot of the trip above 4,500 metres, it's the sort of thing you've just got to have that stuff with you. You can't just rely on not having it.
Yeah, that's right.
And if we go to the show notes for this trip, I'll go through and put some of the images or some of the material from World Expeditions on there, including the trip itinerary. But there's also a lovely little map that shows the altitude. And it's an interesting altitude
It's out
change.
there. It's out there.
Yeah, it is.
So I'm not quite sure if we're going to be talking about the shock piece in all of this, Tim. Which is the moving food, the walking food. I think, if you're a little bit squeamish, if you're, a dedicated vegan, you might want to stop listening for a moment. And, it is a long trip and it makes absolute sense. It makes absolute sense to, take your live food with you and then, do what you need to do. To keep everybody fed at a certain point. But I could imagine for a lot of Westerners that would be quite a shock.
I must admit, a lot of people, I'll say a lot of young kids these days don't have the concept about where their food comes from.
Yeah, we've just had a visit to the country, and someone was saying that, they've been visited by city kids who, thought milk came in a carton out of the supermarket rather than out of a cow.
It is that sort of thing. That this is the way most of the world lives, and having what they class as one-way food. And I do love goat. It's probably one of my favourite meats. So,
not so.
So it's be prepared for that. Cheryl said it was a bit of a shock to her. There's no other way for a trip of that sort of length where you can take meat with you. It's just not an option.
Yeah, and the other thing that they were saying is that this is an adventure. You have to be flexible and you have to be thinking about what's kind of usual and normal for that local area. So there are probably a whole range of other things that they saw that perhaps they expected because they've done other trekking, but maybe somebody who hasn't done so much would be equally as surprised or maybe even shocked by some of those things too.
All right, we hope you've enjoyed this, from what is, for me personally, a really interesting trip, and maybe it's enthused some of you to consider this as an option. It's certainly not a cheap option, but it's certainly an adventure of a lifetime. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. That's all for me. Bye for now.
And bye from me.